Learning tunes. This is a situation I'm sure if you haven't already found yourself in, it will happen at some point where you get the call, oh, do you want this gig on Friday? Cool. Say the day is Wednesday, and then you've got like 2 days to learn a set list of potentially 30 songs for a gig, basically. So this is something I saw on a Facebook group, actually. I think it was like a dep group or something. Someone had got a gig, and they said, oh, I've got this gig, and I've got to learn all these tunes by such a date. Has anyone got any tips on how to do it quickly? So I thought I'd kind of share my thoughts on how to kind of go about learning tunes in a relatively efficient way. So let's go. So the first thing, and this is potentially out of your control, but ideally you want to make sure that you can get a copy of the set list and the keys. And if there's anything specific or any kind of different version of the song, then you've got information about that as well. If you're kind of new to the, function-y, top 40 wedding working man kind of gig thing, there will be tunes that come up quite often, and some people will just go, oh, standard stuff. But ideally, you want a set list. You want to know what you're looking at, just in case there's anything that turns up. So that's the first thing, set list with keys, and if there's anything specific or any medleys or like a first dance, which you might not have heard before, you want to get all that. So that's the first thing. Then when it's over to you, maybe make a playlist so that it's just there and you can just kind of work through it, playlist on Spotify. If there is a tune that is in a different key, so for instance, Respect by Aretha Franklin comes up quite a bit in a few gigs that I do, and they do that like down a tone and a half, I think it's in A, and maybe the original's in C. There is a Chrome extension, so if you are a Google Chrome user, not sponsored, then there is an extension called Transpose, I believe. And what you can do is you go on YouTube, put this little extension on, and you can change the pitch so you can knock it down a few semitones. So if you need something to play along to, you can do that. Depending on what it is, like if it's a song that's in E originally and they want it down a tone or down a semitone, then guitar-wise, that could kind of mess with the positions of things and make riffs that are normally quite easy a bit of a nightmare. And ideally, you don't want to be retuning, if possible, or taking two guitars. Nobody's got time for that. So listening. What I would try and do is listen to the tunes in a way that I've heard people call active listening. So what that is basically, you're not just like listening to the song, you're listening to it and you're kind of taking note of perhaps what your part might be, what the guitar's doing, but perhaps more importantly is trying to clock the structure sort of on the fly and clock what happens. So the way I do this is most tunes will have some sort of setup. They basically establish an idea, that might be like a riff or a chord progression, and that'll be in sections. So they'll usually be, maybe there's an intro, or maybe it just goes straight into a verse, but clock the intro, and then when a new section starts, that's when you kind of draw a dotted line in your mind. So sometimes there might be a song where the intro riff is the same as the verse riff, and maybe you play it, 1, 2, 3 times round or whatever for the intro, and then maybe you play it 4 times round for the verse. Now I wouldn't go in my head, oh, that's 7 times or it's 6 times. I would go, it's twice for the intro, and then dotted line in my mind, start a new count, and then whatever the chord progression is or the riff is 4 times or 8 times or whatever. So you're kind of thinking in sections and phrases, and it's just a bit cleaner because the intro is not going to come back, and you don't want to be like thinking, oh, it's 7 times. When something new happens, that's where you want to draw a line. So listening for chord progressions, listening for when things change, and then try and section it out. Most of the time, when a song has gone intro, verse, maybe some sort of pre-chorus, and then a chorus, by that point, by the time you've got to the end of the first chorus, you've probably got 90% of the song's material, sort of harmonically at least anyway. Then it'll probably go back to a second verse, and then it'll kind of do that same climb to the chorus again. But then perhaps after the second chorus, there's a solo or some sort of new contrasting bit of information, and then maybe a couple of choruses at the end, and maybe an outro. So getting used to that kind of standard format of like, song starts, we're kind of aiming for the chorus most of the time, then it drops back down energy-wise, kind of maybe just does the things that we've already done, up to another chorus, then something new, and then maybe a chorus out. Sort of predicting what's going to happen. And that's another good thing, actually, is once you've done intro, verse, chorus from a listening point of view, once you've heard all that stuff, then try and predict what's going to happen next. Once you've already heard it, once the second verse comes around, go, oh, cool, right, yeah, it's that bit again. And then sort of say, it's probably going to do a build into the chorus. Is it that section again? Oh, yeah, it is. Or maybe the second verse might be slightly shorter. So that happens quite a lot, is the second verse, because we already heard the verse before, it might be a little bit shorter. So predicting these things. And doing that, you kind of get like a quite a nice kind of overhead view of the song from start to finish. And another thing to listen out for is details outside of your instrument. So that might be like a drum fill, it might be a certain vocal thing, it might be maybe there's a keys part that comes in at a certain point, and by that point you know that you're halfway through the second verse or whatever. Is trying to place little markers so you've got more things to kind of hang on to the song to kind of help you know what's coming. Obviously, if you're hanging yourself on markers that are reliant on someone else playing them in the right place, there's that. But not just going, this is the song start to finish, because things go wrong. Maybe the singer comes in at the wrong part. Maybe there's a 2/4 bar that gets missed. Having a better overview of kind of everything that's happening in the song, really, so that you don't get stumped or looking like a fool. So when it comes to actually learning the tune, absolutely no shame in potentially looking at the chords or seeing if a mate of yours has got a chart or something or whatever. As a starting point, a lot of times I'll look up the chords to tunes, and if it's a sort of user-generated database of charts or chords or whatever, there's no guarantee it's going to be correct, but just from a starting point, so you don't have to sit there and work out every single song by ear, that's going to speed things up a little bit. Then start looking at it in sections, the same way you listen to it. Look at the intro, cool, got that. Look at the verse, does something change from the intro? Is it a new part or does it just carry on? And make sure you are doing that dotted line thing of like, right, I'm in the verse now, I'm starting a new count. It's 4 times from now rather than 2 and then another 4 and then counting 6. It's too messy to do that. So the thinking in sections thing is quite a big deal, because initially, say the song went... say that was 1 time round or whatever. Initially, you might be thinking, right, it goes G, and then it goes B minor or B minor 7, then it goes A minor, and then it goes D+4 to D. That's, 5 bits of information? What you want to do is go, well, those 5 things are now one line. You're thinking in phrases. Almost like you're taking, 4 or 5 Lego bricks and then sticking them together to make one big chunk. That is now one line. And then if the verse does that 4 times, then you've got that in 4 chunks. Now that whole thing becomes one chunk. So initially you might be looking at things chord for chord, but once you've got that kind of cyclical 1 time round, make that one thing and then think of a verse as one whole thing as well. So you're thinking in chunks because the brain can only remember so much stuff. Then there might be like a new contrasting section. Most songs have a sense of home. So in that progression, the G is very much the home, so it's in the key of G. What will probably happen in a bridge or a middle 8, or there'll be a contrasting section that will probably have a new sense of home, and this is where a little bit of theory kind of sort of creeps in. So I know that this goes 1, 3, 2, 5, and then back to 1. So it's kind of 1 is the very kind of home base. It starts on there and goes back around and aims for 1 again. New section could be going to the 4, could be going to the 6, so something like this. And then so on. So you can hear that contrast because it's going to a new kind of place, a new kind of semi-permanent home. We're just renting the 4 chord for our bridge or whatever. And this is again where a little bit of theory can help in this kind of stuff. So if I know that goes 1, 3, 2, 5, I've got that to hang on to it, and then when it goes somewhere else, I go, oh, it goes to the 4 chord, and that's a little, a little extra thing to hang it on. I'm not just thinking of every individual event as like a new thing. I'm not like, right, it goes to C now. It's like, oh, it goes to the 4 chord. And the other thing is, if there is an administrative error, which does sometimes happen, and the song is in a different key, it's like, oh, it needs to be a tone down. Then you can go, right, well, we're in G. Now I'm in F. So I've got 1, 3, 2, and then 5. So you can kind of hopefully transpose on the fly, or it gives you a better chance of being able to do that on the fly. Then another thing to think about, and this is something that an arranging lecturer told me at university once, is he was talking about when you're writing parts for people, we talked about explicit and non-explicit information, not explicit in that way. But what it means by that is if you're writing a chart for someone, if there's something that you absolutely need to be there, like it might be a riff or a line or something, take this song, I'm only going to play a bit because of, YouTube stuff. That would be perhaps quite an explicit part that needs to be there. Whereas if you're doing the kind of chordy verse part to that song, it's play that funky music. The original might be... something like that. But that doesn't really need to be too exact. There's like areas around that where it'd still be fine, it will still do the job. But the riff is quite an explicit sort of part. So when you're listening to these tunes, figure out what needs to be there and what doesn't need to be there, especially if you're the only guitar on the gig and maybe there's no key, so you've got to kind of cover a lot of bases. Think about, from a listening perspective, what needs to be there and what doesn't, and how can you maintain weight, so like harmonic weight, sonic weight, and keep the song going, but not trying to stress about getting everything in, because some parts doesn't necessarily need to be that exact. And that goes for things like solos as well. There are some solos that kind of have to be specific, and then there are some solos that you can kind of get away. It's just like a bit of bluesy noise. Then you can kind of maybe start it roughly the same as what the tune starts like, but then it doesn't really matter after that. Maybe the beginning and the end need to be exact, but the middle can kind of be whatever. Like, for instance, the solo to Play That Funky Music. If you were to describe that, it would just be distortion, blues licks, lots of wah. And some bands will kind of have that as a bit more open anyway, so you can kind of do whatever you want. However, something like maybe the solo in Last Night by The Strokes, that's a tune that's come up a few times on set lists. That's kind of shorter and a bit more specific, so that solo kind of has to be how it is. What I'm saying is use your time wisely and don't necessarily stress over getting certain things really exact. There's some parts that, that'll be fine. If it's just some chords, you don't need to get everything absolutely exact. But there'll be some details that you do want to get in. Some solos need to be exact, some not so much. So talking about charts, I tend not to use charts wherever possible because I like to be kind of in the song and like not having part of my brain taken away on charts. There's nothing wrong with using charts. I think if it's a band where you're playing these kind of like pop covers and stuff and then every single person is reading a chart, I think it can perhaps maybe look a bit unprofessional, but that's just maybe my hot take, if you will. But the other thing for me as well is if I'm reading something off a chart, I just don't remember it. I think it's just it's like a passive part of the brain. You're just looking at it. It's going in there, it's coming out of the hands, it's coming out of the amp or whatever. And it's just, there's no retention of information there at all for me anyway. However, if you are going to write charts, I've written charts for first dances quite a bit, only because first dance tunes are notoriously kind of overlooked. Basically, you turn up and people kind of know what's going on, but not massively. And it's somebody's first dance. It's supposed to be like, their special moment. And then the band's like, they're all kind of like hanging by a thread while this holy matrimony is going on. Their big moment as bride and groom or whatever. If you're going to write charts, same thing applies really. Explicit versus non-explicit. I'll get a chart up that I've written out for, I think it was a Taylor Swift tune. And you can see the explicit material, so what needs to be there, and then non-explicit. And then there's parts in between where maybe I'll write something like above a certain part, I'll write octaves, or I'll write accents, or something where I've looked at the song and I do know it's there, but the little word is just a reminder for me to put that there. Or like slightly different second time round, or this is bass only, or vocals only, or whatever. All right, so here's a chart I wrote out for a Taylor Swift song. I kind of sort of half knew the song anyway, and I'd learned it, but I'd written this out just for safety because it was quite involved and the time frame was quite short. So basically, if you notice, I'm writing things out in phrases, so 4 bars on a line where possible. So like down here, you can see my cursor, B minor G, star 1A, star 1A, and then there's an extra bar here, so it's like a 5-bar phrase. So as a result, that is on one line, 5 bars on a line. And if you really wanted to highlight that as a thing, you could do a little bracket here with like a little 5 in it or whatever. So you can see at the top here, I've got lead line. I've got no repeat on DC. I've got 1 bar drums at the top here because I forgot about that when I started writing the chart out. But, it makes it look cleaner anyway. sections, A, B, C, D. That's for two reasons. One is it's a marker for me, so that when I know things change. But the other thing is if I took this to a rehearsal, potentially photocopy this if people needed, and then you've got rehearsal markings, you can go, oh, let's go from letter B. Because if you say, let's go from the bridge, or let's go from the middle eight or whatever, sometimes that can get a bit like, oh, do you mean this? Or, bar 32, and then people have got to like kind of count or whatever. So that just makes things a little bit quicker. Without any of this stuff, it would be pretty open. But these little, because I half knew the tune, but these little things like lead line, and then bass, so this is bass only, stabs on the A's there, and then PM for palm mute, so I'm palm muting here, stabs, drums and mutes, so chicka 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 chicka. I've actually put some rhythm in there, so there's some explicit information there, as opposed to this stuff, which is a bit more kind of open. Stabs at the top there, so that's explicit information. I'm kind of halfway housing it with what I actually need to write out and what I don't. Because I've written this out by hand, because I'm a boomer, like from there, the octaves, I've explicitly written that out. Octaves. So I didn't bother writing the octave, I just put the melody in. I also put the chord above the top so I know what it's happening over. And then I've just written octaves underneath to mark that out. And then B minor G, and then I've put that in there because that's just a long A that goes all the way across. Also, I will highlight navigational information. So repeat marks here at the beginning. Now, some people, this is just my tip for writing charts, if there's a repeat that goes back to the beginning, you don't actually need to write a repeat mark at the beginning. However, I will put one at the beginning and I make them big brackets like this. So I'll put the lines on the top rather than just the two lines and the two dots. So it's kind of like a real kind of, this is what's being repeated right in between here. I will put one at the beginning because say when intro, verse, chorus, whatever, say it got all the way down to here where this DC is, and then it repeated back to the beginning. If I only put the sort of right-hand bracket, if you like, you might get to that repeat mark and go, oh shit, where does it go back to? And then you've got to kind of like scan back and try and figure out where the other repeat mark is. It might be here and you might have missed it. However, if it's not there and it goes back to the beginning, in a split second, you've got to kind of make all those choices. So I would put one at the beginning because then as soon as you see that, you go, oh, there's a repeat coming back here at some point. So you're kind of already primed to be going, oh, I'm going back there at some point. So that's just my little soapbox thing on that, as well as 4 bars on a line. I think it just looks tidier that way. So I've put open here to contrast. All this is being palm muted, and then this is like big and open. Stabs, 2 bars here. Really, I could have stretched that out across all the way across that line, really, but I'll just put the 2 bars, and then that squiggle is just nothing. That's just dead space. And then here, these couple of notes above there, that's because when these chords are happening in the song, after this lead line, it drops into these notes. So again, these are just little half reminders to myself. If I gave this to somebody that hadn't played the song before, obviously it's not that explicit. You're not necessarily going to be able to like sight read this. You'd get through it and it's like halfway between a buskus chart and like an actual chart. And then stabs here. So da, 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 da on those 2 chords. These diamonds just means that these chords are just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then palm mute into a bit of a crescendo. Then here, so this section here, this E section, is the solo. Now, kind of specific solo. It kind of hints at the melody at some parts. And then I've just written little notes to myself. So octaves. So the solo kind of starts with like 3 very distinct sort of bits. So the first part is kind of an octave bit. And then when it gets to here, it's more of it kind of outlines the chorus melody. So I've just written melody over the top. Again, it's just a note to myself to kind of remind me which part's which. And then unison B for unison bends. Don't know why I didn't just write bends, just put B. So ends with unison bends. And then we're back into some stabs, chords. Here, I've just put octaves because I've already written that out here. Same part, same line. I've just put octaves again in brackets. At the end, repeat marks again, and I've put ×3 because it does it 3 times, and then some stabs. So fairly readable chart. You'd have to look at the explicit parts, but for that kind of halfway house, just a reminder for myself, this is perhaps what I would do. You can also, I know people do things on iPads all the time now. I don't actually have an iPad anymore. So, I would just maybe write this out and then take it with me or photocopy it. Again, old school boomer stuff. But you can kind of see how I might do it to heart, because the other thing is writing charts or coming up with charts takes time. You could do just a chord chart on, is it iReal Pro? And there's probably other ones that do a similar thing. But having these little details, like that little octave line there, just to remind you, this little kind of link motif, and then being able to put stabs here and put these little rhythms in. Definitely more useful, kind of halfway house between what is explicit, absolutely needed, and what is not. If I was writing a chart for someone else, then I probably would put all these little details in. I probably would write the melody for the top. Probably would write, this is palm muting, this is open, maybe specific rhythms if I needed it. Perhaps you'd probably just put a rhythm in the first bar and then just sim for similar. But you get the point. So kind of putting all these things into some sort of like bullet point list, if you like. Listening, active listening. So listening to things, taking into account what the guitar part's doing, detail, structure, and then trying to maybe predict what it's going to do the second time round. So listening like actively rather than just kind of listening to the song, kind of following what's going on. That's the first thing. Learning and thinking in sections, so lines and then sections, and then thinking in chunks. Because then later on, once you've got past the chorus, it's like, oh, it's just that chunk again. Or maybe it's that chunk, but it's halved, and then it's just that chunk again. So thinking in big chunks, not thinking of like note for note or chord for chord, trying to zoom out. Then perhaps having a bit of theory knowledge to kind of hang on to these things. So like we said, the song that went 1, 3, 2, 5 or whatever. Being able to think in those terms, both just so you've got an extra thing to hang on to the chord progressions in the song. But then also just in case maybe the singer's feeling ill that day and you need to drop it a tone or whatever. And then thinking about explicit versus not explicit information. What needs to be there, what doesn't. If you are playing on your own and there's no other instrument playing chords or putting in harmony down, then you're probably going to just have to try and stick to chords and then try and probably play them as low as possible to beef the sound up. Whereas if you've got two guitars, who's taking what? If you've got a keyboard player, maybe you can just pick out the guitar parts that you want. And also, and this is something that I've seen people that are slightly green maybe not do so well, is if there is no guitar part, then coming up with something. That's another skill that perhaps doesn't really get talked about. The other week we did a first dance that was Make You Feel My Love, the Adele version. And that's basically just piano all the way through. And I didn't really want to leave the piano player out there, hanging out to dry while this first dance goes. So I just thought, what would work here? Maybe a bit of delay, spacey, minimal sort of guitar part. And I just sort of picked through some chords while he was doing his thing. It's probably something like... or whatever, you know what I mean? Being able to come up with a part. I've seen people just sit there, especially a particular keyboard player that just literally sat there for a whole song because it's like, oh, there's no keys in this. And then would come in with like a really aggressive synth from hell for like 2 bars and then just go back to sitting there. Get involved, man, get involved. So hopefully some of this stuff helps. It's one of those situations that you might find yourself in, and trying not to get stressed because the deadline is looming is definitely a thing, because you just don't kind of retain stuff, or you can't really think straight when you're like mega stressed. As I said, saw the Facebook thread, thought I'd throw some thoughts in the hat if it ever comes up. Peace.